So, firstly, before I begin, I'd just like to say a big thank you to Anna, Lindy and Thomas for what has been so far a fascinating series of presentations, and indeed the series in November as well too. So thank you very much for allowing me to participate as well. I want to talk primarily about some of the research work, and it's very preliminary at this stage, but research work I've been doing into the so-called Cambridge loan of Cypriot material, which ended up in the Nicholson Museum, or now the Nicholson collection at the University of Sydney's Chow Chak Wing Museum in 1947. But I thought I'd also try and contextualise the development of Australian archaeology on the island of Cyprus and frame some of the questions in terms of the development of post-colonial thinking. Australia, like Cyprus, of course, was a former colony of the British Empire, although our situation was very different in many ways, but also similar in some ways. So I wanted to just bring out a couple of parallels and to explore some issues in terms of the impact that Australians have had on the development of archaeology in Cyprus in the 20th century, but also to reflect the impact that Cyprus has had upon the development of archaeology in Australia as well, both in terms of some positive and negative aspects. So to begin, I take you back to the beginning of the colonial occupation of the continent of Australia and the establishment of the colony of New South Wales in January of 1788, traditionally marked as the 26th of January, which is recognised as Australia Day, the national day, but has in more recent years become a major day of contention, and quite a number of Australians would now refer to it as Invasion Day rather than Australia Day as well, reflecting the fact that the raising of the British flag in the late 18th century in Sydney Harbour had a dramatic impact upon the First Nations people of the continent of Australia. And of course, where that ship landed was on Gadi land, the land of the Gadigal people. And where that flag was raised was an area called Warrun, overlooked by Dubaglee. These are areas that those names have not been mentioned for more than 200 years. But in a post-COVID world where hopefully you can come and visit us down under, it's an area which you would now know as Sydney Cove, the very heart of the CBD of the city of Sydney, overlooked by Bennelong Point and the infamous Sydney Opera House as well. One of the things that you'll notice is that from the very beginning of European settlement in Australia, the archaeology and the tradition of the First Nation people, from the Gadigal people of Sydney, right across the hundreds of nations and the hundreds of different Aboriginal language and cultural groups, were neglected really in terms of any type of scholarly interest and in terms of any type of archaeological engagement until very, very recent. So I show you here an image painted not long after the raising of that flag by one of the First Fleet members, and you'll see the Gadigal people in the harbour watching the European settlers, the English settlers. And one of the things that is quite apparent, and this of course has been discussed in quite some length in terms of Australian post-colonial history, and in particular Australian art history, is the way how increasingly in visualizations these people become marginalised in terms of the viewpoint of what Australian history is. I'll come back to that point in a moment. Now, of course, at the same time that this was taking place, Cyprus itself was still part of the Ottoman Empire, and you will see, of course, a number of profound changes and a number of impacts that are occurring at the same time that the various colonies of what will become eventually Australia are established. That there are reflections in terms of the way that the administration of the Ottomans are having impacts upon the daily life of the inhabitants of the island. As the European settlements in firstly Sydney and then later Hobart and then later Melbourne begin to grow and prosper, what is interesting, of course, is the gradual development of Mediterranean and classical influences within colonial Australia in terms of architecture, in terms of plaster cast sculptures and copies of you know, the Parthenon frieze, as I show you here from Perth in Western Australia, and the complete replica built in the 1860s of the Lysocratic monument of Athens, which for a number of years actually sat in the garden of a former Premier of New South Wales, and has in more recent years been on display in the Royal Botanic Gardens of Sydney. Indeed, actually, my wife and I got married right in front of that particular monument. So one of the interesting things is that within the English or British colonial perspective within Australia, there is constant referencing to European antiquities and European history, but a complete neglect of the 80,000 plus years of Aboriginal history of the continent. And this is seen in a number of interesting ways. In 1989, archaeological work being conducted on a series of 19th century foundations of houses in an area of Sydney called the Rocks, one of the very first settlement sites, and indeed an area where a large number of convicts were actually housed, including one ancestor of mine. And this archaeological project that was taking place in the late 1980s, coincidentally, is now underneath one of the major hotels in Sydney. But during the excavation, of course, the team were finding typical material deposited underneath floorboards in a historical archaeological context, small items of domestic usage of the 19th century, a lot of blue transfer printware, as you would find elsewhere in Sydney and indeed in Melbourne and other cities in Australia. But to their surprise, they were finding eventually Egyptian and Roman antiquities. And instead of panicking and thinking that Eric von Daniken was somehow responsible, of course, detailed historical investigation proved that in the 1820s, there was actually an antiquity dealer in one of those properties who was obviously trading in antiquities. Now, this is incredibly early in terms of the history of European settlement, but also turned on its head the long-held theory that the area of the Rocks was a slum area only inhabited by poor people. But here you have the transportation of Mediterranean antiquities to Australia at a very, very early date. Not yet from Cyprus, we'll get to that in a moment. Contrast this, of course, right throughout the 19th century with that marginalisation of the historical narrative of the original inhabitants of the country. And again, as you'll see in paintings, and as I mentioned before, that marginalisation of Aboriginal people to the very fringes of the development of the British settlements in the country. Towards the end of the 19th century, of course, in 1878, you have the establishment of the British Protectorate in Cyprus. What's really interesting is, again, that contrast between the two different colonies and the impact that the British control had on the development of both island nations. Because in Australia at that point in time, you're beginning to see a rethink in terms of the ways that the colonies would operate. I show you an image of I guess, as close as Australia gets to a George Washington style figure, Sir Henry Parkes. He becomes the Premier of New South Wales later in that same year. He would later on become one of the key figures in the gradual development of Australian Federation, the unification of the various British colonies to create a new nation state. And at the same point in time, a few other quirky points of Australian history, including the famous Australian bushranger, Ned Kelly, really beginning his 18-month spree of crime, depending upon your perspective, either a folk hero rising up against the establishment or else a very nasty criminal. But again, it's a representation of how the European settlement sees Australia as nation building and First Nation people are being written off. Now, what's interesting is that if you do a cursory glance, just a cursory glance, let alone a detailed dive into the archives, and the National Library of Australia actually has a digital program where thousands of pages of newspapers and magazines have been scanned and are very easy to access. But if you look at references for Cyprus in the 1878, one of the interesting things is you'll see that Australians were actually following developments quite keenly. And this is in places as diverse as Launceston in Tasmania, and in Wagga Wagga, the country town in New South Wales. The acquisition of Cyprus into the British Empire as a protectorate is something which is commented upon, and indeed, at later stages in the development of 1915, when Cyprus becomes officially a colony of the British Empire, again, Australian newspapers are keen to comment upon what's generally regarded at that point in time in Australia as a positive move. The general approval within Australia of British control of Cyprus is perhaps best expressed in this Adelaide newspaper of 1879, in which the antiquities and archaeology of the island is actually put forward as one of the key justifications by the author for the British taking control of Cyprus. So it's interesting that, again, there is considerable interest in archaeology and antiquities in an island, which is not a place where many Europeans travelling between Britain and other places in Europe and Australia are stopping off at. Contrast this with Egypt, for example, that once the Suez Canal is opened, becomes the major trading or a major stopping point for travellers by sea between Australia and Europe for decades, many, many decades. So Cyprus is perhaps not on the radar of most Australians in a way that Egypt and Italy perhaps is, but there is still much discussion in contemporary newspapers about British control of the island. And what's interesting is that if you look over subsequent decades, there continues to be periodic but ongoing media reporting of archaeology taking place in Cyprus. And I show you here a very short report in Brisbane about the Cyprus Exploration Fund working at Paleopaphos. Again, other seasons. 1928 report on the Swedish Cyprus expedition, again in a Brisbane newspaper, the Brisbane Courier. And I show you also from the late 1920s this piece which describes the discovery of the famous bronze statue of Septimius Severus, now on display in the Cyprus Museum. And the main reason I put this one in is, again, if you look at the title, you'll see the typo which is entered in, or has been entered in by the sub-editors. And I just mark in passing that it was the Adelaide Advertiser, which was the first newspaper in the world owned by Rupert Murdoch. So make of that as you will. It continues on until the 20th century. Again, often reporting on a whole range of different archaeological projects and discoveries on the island. These are often being picked up by Associated Press and repeating of news stories that are being reported within the British and, to a lesser extent, the American media. But nonetheless, some smaller Australian towns are still following archaeological developments in Cyprus, which I find really interesting, and I would actually really like to do at some stage a survey, a much deeper survey in terms of which of the archaeological projects over the decades were being reported on within the Australian media and which ones were not. And again, it goes on right throughout the period right up until the independence and the Republic of Cyprus. I put in this one from 1952 simply because it's in the Illawarra Mercury, which is the local newspaper in the town of Wollongong where I was born. Now, contrast all of this interest in a Mediterranean island with the popular perceptions of classical archaeology, if not necessarily the much broader picture of a development from a prehistoric to a historic cultural site, with ongoing contemporary commentary about the archaeology of the First Nation people of Australia. And I refer here to two figures that loom very large in my professional life, Sir Charles Nicholson and Professor Arthur Dale Trendall. Nicholson, I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment, was the founder of the Nicholson Museum and the Antiquities collection at the University of Sydney, where I work. And Sir Charles Nicholson was was a man who would be regarded by his contemporaries as being incredibly liberal in his outlook and his attitude. He did actually write a very, very small piece about Aboriginal stone tools, which was published in published in London in the 1860s once he'd returned to Britain. But in the 20th of January in 1863 in Leeds, Anna, you'll be pleased to know, he actually gave a public lecture in which he described Aboriginal society in a manner which was probably relatively standard of the era, but of course, through the lens of 21st century vision, is absolutely horrific. The concept that they are the lowest types of humanity to be found anywhere, and that they are a degraded race in intellect. They were never more than children and should be treated as such in terms of government policy. Now, this is coming out of an incredibly influential political figure in colonial New South Wales, a founder of the University of Sydney, and a man with a deep and profound passion for antiquities. So that dichotomy between the reflection of the way he would look at historical cultures in the Mediterranean and within Egypt, and indeed within Cyprus, with the way he would look at ancient and indeed living cultures here in Australia is really quite astonishing. The article from 1952 from the Sydney Daily Telegraph, an interview with Dale Trendall, and again, I'll show you some images of Trendall in a moment, but it's a rather interesting piece. And to me, the actual quote doesn't really seem like something that Trendall himself would have said. It's probably an embellishment by the reporter, but nonetheless, it does show you that in that post-World War II period, large amounts of Aboriginal artifacts and artworks were being swapped with European institutions for prehistoric stone tools and other flints and other implements, and that the Nicholson Museum was actually the beneficiary of some of these swaps. And so the quote, in effect saying to Egypt, "I'll swap you 7 nullas, 3 bark paintings, 2 records of corroborees, a skull and a didgeridoo for a musical instrument, for a shop-soiled mummy case in good condition," and the deal is clinched. And a separate project that I'm involved in is that we're actually trying to track down what items were actually exchanged with various European institutions throughout the 1950s and 1940s, 1950s and 1960s. So this is within living memory. And again, a really profound reflection of how much the colonial impact of the settlement of New South Wales was ignoring Aboriginal society. The very first probably proper archaeological investigations into Aboriginal Australia take place in the 1920s, but they're very amateur in scale. You don't start getting a real scientific and academic interest until the 1960s. And the institution that I'm at, the University of Sydney, although it has the first archaeology department in Australia, and in large part as a result of James Stewart's employment, doesn't actually start teaching Aboriginal archaeology until the 1970s. And indeed, we don't have an endowed chair dedicated to the research of Aboriginal Australia until 2008. And Stewart himself, and indeed Stewart's successor, Alexander Campitoglu, both actively campaigned against the teaching of Aboriginal archaeology at the University of Sydney through much of the 1950s and 1960s as well. So it's a remarkable reflection in terms of a really interesting dichotomy when seen through a 21st century lens, in terms of an interest in the prehistory of a Mediterranean region, but a complete disregard for the prehistory of the local environment in which we were working and living. Oops. Now, moving on to the 20th century, of course, in 1901, federation was finally realised and Australia did become an independent nation, although it's worthwhile bearing in mind that independence came with some caveats. And indeed, it wasn't until 1931, the same year as the Cyprus Revolt, I should point out, that the British Parliament actually passed legislation for the first time saying that it would not influence legislation passed in Australia. wasn't ratified by the Australian government until World War II, interestingly. And indeed, it was not until 1986 that the British Parliament finally passed legislation saying that it would no longer have any say whatsoever over the passing of legislation in Australia. So just like Cyprus, the legacy of that colonial period lingered for a long, long time. And one of those is that Australia itself went from being a colony to a coloniser, that Papua New Guinea and a number of other islands in the South Pacific fell under the administrative control of Australia, and arguably we did a very bad job of being a coloniser as well. Now, in terms of antiquities, I mentioned Sir Charles Nicholson before, the founder of the Nicholson collection at the University of Sydney, who between 1856 and 1858 amassed a very large collection of antiquities, primarily from Egypt and Italy, that would become the foundation of what would become eventually the Nicholsonian Museum, eventually the Nicholson Museum, and now the Nicholson collection of a much larger museum, which I'll get to in a moment. Nicholson was very much of the opinion that Australians or people of the colony of New South Wales needed to know their history, and their history was European. So they needed direct access to material cultures. And what he did was provide them with a teaching museum and a teaching collection. Bearing in mind, of course, there were no archaeology courses taught at the University of Sydney at this point in time, but this was for the benefit of the colony of New South Wales. And as that collection grew and grew and grew throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, Cypriot Antiquities would become a major component of it. The Nicholson collection is now home to more than 2,500 items from the island. And of course, I don't have time tonight to mention it, but I will, of course, or to go into detail, but will, of course, mention that there are Cypriot antiquities across a range of Australian cultural institutions and university museums, all of which were catalogued by Jenny Webb in the late 1990s and early in this century as well, in 2 volumes published in the Simmer series as well. The Nicholson Museum would grow and grow, as I mentioned, and last year, in November of 2020, it was combined with a number of other museums at the University of Sydney into a new museum, the Chow Chak Wing Museum, of which I show you images here. We've just opened to the public. I, of course, would love for you to come and see it, but we'll have to wait until travel restrictions are lifted. But I was able to curate an exhibition as part of the opening suite of exhibitions called Crossroads, Ancient Cyprus, in which we highlight a number of the items from Cyprus that have ended up in Australia. And what's interesting is that the very first known Cypriot antiquity to end up in the continent of Australia is this alabastron-shaped jar donated by Sir Charles Nicholson himself in 1860 as part of the initial benefaction to the University of Sydney. Now, to the best of our knowledge, Sir Charles Nicholson never went to Cyprus. Fire did destroy most of his correspondence and diaries in the late 1890s, so we'll never know for sure. But we do have his passport in our archives, and there's no indication he went to Cyprus, although increasingly we seem to have evidence that he went to some other places that it's not reflected in his passport either. It's probable that he's acquired this somewhere in London, and from a dealer or from at auction or something, but we just have no evidence whatsoever. But this is the first item from the island to end up in Australia, to anybody's knowledge. And that was followed en masse in the 1920s by 24 objects that came via the Metropolitan Museum of Art that were formerly parts of the Cesnola collection. Robert Merrilees and myself have published a paper in 2019 where we discuss these 24 items plus other Cesnola collection items that ended up in Australia eventually. And I won't go into too much detail because it is all in that publication in Mediterranean Archaeology. But it effectively comes about because the then curator of the Nicholson collection contacts the Met saying, do you have anything on offer? We've got a little bit of money, not much. And he effectively gets talked into acquiring some Cesnola pieces which are being discarded at that point in time. And the smoking gun in this entire research was a document found in the archives of the Australian Institute of Archaeology in Melbourne, dated to 1927, which is effectively the list of the costs of those 23 pieces in all. But what is interesting is that 24 were actually sent out to Sydney. So it was like something was added in from the Met as well. Part of the tangled web of the dispersal of Cypriot items across the globe. Oops, sorry. This is mislabeled, but this is the display of the Nicholson Museum featuring a number of Cypriot items in 1947 after the museum had reopened. It was closed for a short period during World War II. And at this point in time, it now becomes the fundamental teaching tool for the then newly established Department of Archaeology. And the Department of Archaeology, founded at the university, was driven by Dale Trendall, who I mentioned before, and who you're going to see. Known to probably everybody listening in this, but Trendall, of course, was an expert in South Italian red-figured pottery, and very much regarded himself as an art historian rather than an archaeologist. So if he was going to found a Department of Archaeology, he needed a field archaeologist. And so he actually managed to hunt down, and again, largely also as a result of some financial manoeuvring behind the scenes, including quite considerable financial support by Walter Beasley, a Melbourne-based businessman, acquired the services of James Stewart. Now, I don't have time to talk too much about Stewart, and again, he's a figure very well known to all of us, the subject of a number of biographical papers by Robert Merrilees, and of course, the subject of a 2003 CAARI conference. But he had, by the time he was employed by the University of Sydney, and you'll see his staff photograph here, of course, excavated with his first wife, Eleanor, at Vulnos in 1937 and 1938, and already had considerable fieldwork experience in other places in the Eastern Mediterranean, but was very much dedicated to the idea of an Australian presence on the island of Cyprus. Okay, so Vulnos, of course, the Vulnos publication. Yep,
Craig, could you wrap up now, please? Thank you.
Yes, I will do. So I just wanted to quickly say again, in the newspapers, as you begin to get Australian fieldwork, this is being reflected in contemporary newspaper accounts at the time. But the Cambridge loan was one of the things that came with Stewart, and it's a series of artefacts of unknown number. There is no official documentation that's been found in either Sydney or in Cambridge, and this was hunted down both in the 1980s by Kate Lawler at the University of Sydney, and I've more recently done some investigation. We don't know precisely how many items were transported, at least 160 of them. The condition was that it had to be nothing which was going to be incorporated in the CVA of the Cambridge volume of the CVA. But interestingly, 27 items actually were returned because they were in part of that CVA publication. It was an amalgamation material from the Fitzwilliam and the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Some items were given a CL number in Sydney, symbolising the Cambridge loan. Others were not, so there's an inconsistency. And what we have is material that's come to Cambridge via private collections of the Ransom family, of Sir Henry Bulwer, Dr. Goulamard, as we heard yesterday in Robert's paper, material from the Cyprus Expedition Fund, and so on. The loan itself is largely as a result of connections between Trendall and A.W. Lawrence. The loan was described as a collection, not brilliant, but fairly representative of the island, apart from a small gap in the Iron Age. And the concept was it would form a really good foundation for the teaching of Cypriot archaeology at the University of Sydney by James Stewart. 6 cases arrived in October of 1947, and I'll just quickly, wrapping up, show you that in some cases we can trace them back to the original collection, but in many cases we have no idea where they've come from. Some, of course, from Tamassos through a one-time British administrator on the island, Sir Henry Bulwer, some from the Ransom family collection, as I mentioned before, and then finally some items from the Cyprus Exploration Fund. So of all the places for the material to end up in the Southern Hemisphere, it does give you an indication of just the breadth of the dispersal of Cypriot antiquities. Thank you, and apologies for going over time, Thomas.
Thank you, Craig. It's very rich